Hello, my friend, and welcome to Something for Everybody. My name is Aaron Machbitz, and today is a solo episode of the podcast where I'm discussing narcissism. So let's really talk about narcissism and what it actually is, because narcissists have a prominent place in popular imagination. The label narcissist is widely deployed to refer to people who appear too full of themselves. There's also a growing sense that narcissism is on the rise all around the world, especially among young people, although most psychological research does not support this notion. The word narcissist is being thrown out to describe so many people these days, and most people just have it wrong and don't understand sort of the finer details about what it is. And so we're going to talk about that in this episode. Narcissism is widely viewed on a spectrum. The trait is normally distributed in the population, with most people scoring near the middle and few sort of at either extreme. It's easy to describe someone who spends a bit too much time talking about her career or who never seems to doubt himself as a narcissist. But the trait is much more complicated than that. Narcissism does not necessarily represent a surplus of self-esteem or of insecurity. More accurately, it encompasses a hunger for appreciation or admiration, a desire to be in the center of attention, and an expectation of special treatment and reflecting perceived higher status. Most of us, will display at least one narcissistic trait at some point in our lives. These may be considered narcissistic behaviors or attitudes, but they differ from the actual personality disorder in severity, frequency, and duration. That's really important. So all of us will express some narcissistic traits or characteristics, but they differ from the actual personality disorder in severity, frequency, and duration. Extremely important. Actual pathological narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder is rare. It affects an estimated 1% of the population, a prevalence that hasn't changed since clinicians started measuring it. The disorder is suspected when narcissistic traits impair a person's daily functioning. So I think those things are important to understand when just willy-nilly labeling someone a narcissist. We have to think about these ideas because real narcissistic personality disorder is actually rare. And again, we're going to move on a spectrum, and some people throughout their life, based on certain situations they're in, are going to display certain narcissistic characteristic traits. But again, the frequency, severity, and duration will change based on if it's an actual personality disorder or not. And then when you think about narcissism, there are two different forms. We all know and are most familiar with the grandiose form of narcissism, but there's also the vulnerable narcissist, which I think is quite interesting as well, and we're going to talk about that throughout this episode. And so grandiose narcissism is characterized by extroversion, low neuroticism, overt expressions of feelings of superiority and entitlement, whereas vulnerable narcissism is marked by introspective self-absorbedness, high neuroticism, and alternating feelings of excessive pride and deep shame. Grandiose narcissism is one of the traits in the dark tetrad, also known as the dark quad, which is a set of interrelated negative personality features, and the other three traits being psychopathy, sadism, and Machiavellianism, along with your narcissistic personality disorder, make up the dark tetrad. Dr. Jordan Peterson has talked about that a lot. If you're interested in learning more about those other three negative personality disorders. On the other hand, you have vulnerable narcissism. And that's found its way into a different but related triad of personality, the so-called vulnerable dark triad, which is the constellation of three vulnerable dark personalities, which is vulnerable narcissism, secondary psychopathy, and borderline personality. Vulnerable narcissism is far more subtle and a bit harder to pin down than its grandiose counterpart, hence the name grandiose and vulnerable. Although vulnerable narcissism is hard to spot due to its subtle and somewhat unfamiliar manifestation, it's nonetheless associated with its own distinct patterns of thought and behavior. So I'm going to give you 6 of the most common characteristics according to research and data. 1, you have an introverted personality. If you're a vulnerable narcissist, you are just as convinced that you are above most others as your grandiose counterpart, but you have a much more introverted personality about it. So that's an interesting distinction to think about. Number 2, you have neurotic personality. If you're a vulnerable narcissist, you are likely to be high in neuroticism, another dimension of the personality of the Big Five model, which is also something that Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about heavily. Number 3, we won't say it out loud, but you thrive on attention and accolades. That's an important distinction there as well, that beginning part. We won't say it out loud, but we ultimately do thrive on attention and accolades. Number 4, you are prone to feelings of shame. Your self-image is split into positive self-image that is characterized by excessive pride and a negative self-image that is ridden with shame. This split makes you hypersensitive, even to sort of gentle feedback and constructive criticism. That's a really key point of vulnerable narcissism. And number 5, you blame others for your mistakes. You rarely accept responsibility for your actions because when things go wrong, you tend to feel that it just isn't your fault. Rather, other people or circumstances are to blame for your mishaps, never you. And then number 6, you take but rarely give. You are always looking to receive more than you give. And so those are 6 very common characteristics of a vulnerable narcissist. And so now we can move forward, since you have some more information about vulnerable narcissism and what it may be and sort of the subtle signs that you can use to pick it up in your life. Let's move back to grandiose narcissism. Because really, when people are referring to you're a narcissist, they're talking about the grandiose narcissist. Now, I think there might be some people in your life who have more traits leaning towards the vulnerable narcissist, but again, it depends on severity, frequency, and duration for it to actually be the personality disorder. But when we think about pointing the finger at someone being a narcissist, we're really thinking about grandiose narcissism. So let's really think about what it is, so we're not just pointing it and saying everyone has this personality disorder, because as we learned earlier, it's about 1% of the population, but we know that there are certain characteristics and traits that we all possess, but it's on a spectrum. And so back to grandiose narcissism. Dysfunction of the disorder typically causes friction in relationships due to the pathological narcissist lack of empathy. It may also manifest as antagonism fueled by grandiosity and attention seeking. And seeing themselves as superior, the pathological narcissist naturally views everyone else as inferior and may be intolerant of disagreement or questioning. Exaggeration is often the basis for grandiosity. This means that people with NPD or narcissistic personality disorder tend to have an inflated sense of self-importance. They may feel they're more powerful, intelligent, capable, and charming than they really are, and more than most other people just in general. To reaffirm this sense of superiority, someone with this specific narcissistic personality may exaggerate or lie about their accomplishments, skills, and talents. People with narcissistic personality may constantly fantasize about having unlimited power, intelligence, beauty, acceptance, or love. They often believe they deserve way more than others. So now you're sort of getting a fuller picture of what this really is. It's not just someone, who talks about themselves a little too much or thinks highly of themselves or has just a little bit more confidence. It's on these extreme measures where you start to see that it's actually a pathological disorder like narcissistic personality disorder. And so let's get into a little bit more specifics about this grandiose narcissist. One, they have a sense of specialness and uniqueness. People with NPD may have the need to highlight how special and unique they are in comparison to everyone else. Now, it's important to understand that, I believe everyone is special and everyone is unique in their own specific ways. But again, these are on the severity, duration, and extreme portion of this all, which makes someone potentially have the sort of grandiose version of narcissism. This also leads them to believe that they can be only understood by or associate with other really special and really unique people or groups, which sort of can make them a bit isolated in that term. If someone doesn't actually get them, it's because they're not as smart, they're not as special, and they're not as unique as this grandiose narcissist. Next one is sort of this need for praise and attention. People with narcissistic personality may have a constant need to be admired and praised. They might seek constant attention and might not take well to any form of criticism because that's an attack on their ego and their self-esteem. They may also resent others who don't think they are doing and saying, who don't think what they are doing is, let's say, great or super exceptional. Water break or element break, excuse me. Next, these types of folks have a strong sense of entitlement. Someone with NPD may be convinced they deserve special treatment and have the right to all available privileges, all of them. Similarly, people with NPD might feel everyone should comply with their expectations and demands, just basically doing whatever they say whenever they say it because they're so unique, special, powerful, intelligent, capable. They're God's gift to earth. Grandiose narcissists have a tendency to exploit others, right? Because at the top, they lack empathy. And so manipulation and exploitation tactics are very common in many people with this narcissistic personality disorder. This means that they take advantage of others to achieve their own goals because there's a need for personal gain above everything else. People with NPD might also use strategies such as spreading lies about others in order to get ahead. In many instances, a person with NPD may turn to cruelty when they feel their needs aren't met or they're getting attacked or if someone doesn't treat them the way that they absolutely expect them to treat them. And so there's a lot of interesting factors that go into this stuff. And then one I just mentioned, which I think is a super important one when it comes to this grandiose narcissist, is a lack of empathy. Someone with, the real form of NPD might be unable to connect with the needs of others or put themselves in someone else's shoes. This is one of the main reasons why they might behave in cruel or manipulative or exploitative ways. This lack of empathy might also show as selfishness, disregard for others, lack of compassion for someone who is injured or needs help, and just this disregard and lack of compassion for any others who are experiencing or feeling things that are challenging or hard or are not in line with what this grandiose narcissism is trying to do. It doesn't fit in their plan and their mold. They just have a total lack of empathy or care. And these next few go right along with that, which is, there's a lot of jealousy, envy, and distrust. People with this personality disorder usually believe others are competing with them are envious of who they are. In the same way, they may often compete with others or feel envious of their accomplishments because nobody can be doing better than them. That's like, this is not possible. That's the lack of empathy. That's the jealousy, the envy, the distrust, the manipulation, all in regards to building oneself up while tearing others down. And so they have a lot of arrogance and scorn, which is the next two, right? Some people with narcissistic personality may disregard others as worthless or ridiculous or even despicable, depending on sort of the severity of the situation. This belief may lead them to display an attitude of arrogance and scorn. And so that's just this is not a full comprehensive everything you need to know about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder and grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism, but it is a lot of really important key points that we can start to understand to, one, distinct between someone who's just displaying some narcissistic characteristics on the spectrum that we all have, and then understanding when it leads to an actual personality disorder and if that personality disorder is grandiose or if it's vulnerable. So now we understand some of these common characteristics, these common traits, and how we can maybe pick them out. And then you can refer back to this episode if something actually might be happening in your life, or someone you know, someone you work with, a colleague, a friend, a family member is sort of displaying these characteristics on a higher frequency, a higher severity, and on a higher duration as we learn, because that's when it turns into a dysfunction or it's actually causing problems in one's life where it's harder to function, hence the dysfunction, and then potentially it may actually be a personality disorder, or potentially maybe a sign that they're going through something hard, they're having a challenging situation, and these characteristics are just being drawn out of them based on sort of a threat response or how they're just handling the situation. So it's really important to understand a lot of these things, to know potentially where this person that you know is at in life, and also potentially how to protect yourself in these situations, and understanding these underlying characteristics about, okay, maybe I shouldn't associate as much with this person or shouldn't share all my personal details because it could be manipulated in a certain way. It's just understanding the full spectrum of what this personality trait offers and knowing that the actual personality disorder is very rare. But some people do express these not some people, all of us do express these characteristics and these traits at some point throughout our life. But again, I think one of the most important parts of this episode was understanding the severity, the frequency, and the duration, and then understanding truly the common characteristics that go with the vulnerable narcissist and the grandiose narcissist and the personality triads and tetrads that they fall into, because those clusters are also important to understand. And so if we recap just a little bit here, we have narcissistic personality disorder is a formal mental health diagnosis. It's not a personal choice of behaviors, and it requires a proper diagnosis by a true professional. So we can't just point the finger and say everyone has narcissism if they're just a little bit more egotistical than the next guy. And although there are different subtypes of NPD, the most common, like we talked about, the subtypes vulnerable and grandiose, the most common symptoms are always going to be, not always, that's not the right word to use, are going to be a strong sense of entitlement and superiority, the need for attention, and the really crucial one is that lack of empathy. These symptoms can have a direct impact on how the person relates to others and how the person relates to themselves. So based on this episode, let's aim just to be a little bit more precise with our words than just constantly calling everyone a narcissist. Since now we truly do have a better understanding of what it is and what it's not, let's aim to be a little bit more precise with our language, not just with this, but specifically with all things when it comes to labeling someone as something. Let's be precise with our language. Let's try to understand them a little bit better, understand what we're trying to potentially call them, and be very precise about the labels we put on people, what we're calling people, and understand the full spectrum of the thing you're trying to call them. Because now we understand it. Refer back to this episode. Use this episode as a springboard to learn even more about this personality disorder and a bunch of other personality disorders, so we can have an understanding and a full spectrum about humans and how we move through the world and maybe our own experience. And all these things are extremely important when it comes to trying to live our absolute best life and create the absolute best relationships that we can. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for tuning into that episode. Hope you found it useful and informative. If you did, the best way to support this podcast is by sharing it with a friend. Send the link over to anyone that you might find this useful. That's the absolute best marketing tool, we have on this podcast. So I appreciate you doing that, and I appreciate you being here, and so much love for you. And I'll see you guys next time. Cheers. Thank you very much for tuning into that episode. And if you enjoyed it, click right here for another full-length episode of the podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe. But most importantly, above all else, please take good care of yourselves and others. And I'll see you next time. Lots of love. Cheers.